Okay, well, before I start, I just want to thank Nora and Beth and everybody else who put this event together. This is really nice to be here. And also, the second thing, just before I start, is to say I'm going to shift directions, which is fine, I think, and hopefully not everybody is just here just for energy efficiency. And I think also my talk will set up Brittany's final talk quite well. So, yeah, climate change and the human moral judgment system. So, if I asked all of you a question, and I'm not asking it, this is rhetorical, what kind of issue is climate change? I suspect many of you would say that it's a scientific or environmental one. Some might say that it's a political or economic or technical issue. And especially given our setting today, I think many of you would say that climate change is a behavioral or social issue. And those are all correct responses. But what research that I and a few others have been conducting has found over the past year or two is that relatively fewer of you, I suspect, would say that climate change is a moral or ethical issue. And especially not as your first response to this kind of question when I ask you to categorize climate change and how do you think about it. And indeed, even when I've made this easier for people by asking them very directly, is climate change an ethical or moral issue, still only about 40 to 50% of people respond affirmatively. And that's even when we just look at people who think that climate change is happening. Now, from a normative perspective, climate change is very clearly an ethical issue. And when I say normative, I mean from like what a philosopher would say and how we would think about this as a very reasoned argument or issue. Right? Climate change involves the voluntary actions of a relatively small number of people, all of us basically in this room, causing a lot of harm to many others, both people in the future and non-human species. Those who are least responsible for the problem, including future generations, people who aren't even alive yet, are likely to bear the greatest burdens from climate change. But those who are most responsible for having caused the problem, both people living today and also in the past, really aren't going to face the greatest burdens. And as the moral philosopher Peter Singer has put it, climate change represents a massive misappropriation by rich individuals and rich countries of what is essentially a public good, namely the use of the atmosphere as a sink for our greenhouse gas emissions. And I think in some ways the most intuitive is that we can do something about climate change, as we've already heard about today, right? If climate change were 100% naturally occurring, and there was nothing that we could do to mitigate its harms, there was nothing that we could do to help people adapt to whatever changes are coming, there might be an argument that it's an environmental catastrophe, that it's an environmental issue, that it's a scientific issue, but it's not a moral issue. But as we've already heard, and I think as all of you probably already know, there's a lot that we can do about climate change. So from a normative perspective, climate change is an ethical issue. The question that I've been interested in, and that I've been looking at over the past year or two, and that others have as well, is why don't we recognize climate change as a moral imperative? Right? Because again, if we did, we might not even be having today's symposium. Right? If we really recognize climate change as a question of right and wrong, responsibility and blame, we should have probably done something about it. And we can think of other issues that we respond to very much as moral ones. Right? So questions of right to abortion, even gun rights, gay marriage, and all sorts of other hot-button social issues, we're very quick to identify as moral ones. But there's something about climate change that's different. And so what I want to suggest in today's talk, and this is work that I've been doing with my collaborator Azim Sharif at the University of Oregon, and that, as Beth mentioned, will come out in a month or two, is that features of climate change and the way that we talk about climate change, both amongst ourselves, but also especially in the mass media, interact with how the human moral judgment system operates to inhibit and weaken our moral intuitions about climate change, and subsequently to inhibit and weaken our moral resolve to do anything about the issue. Right? And in particular, what I'm going to talk about briefly today are 4 challenges that I think that climate change and how we talk about it pose to the human moral judgment system, and I will talk about what that moral judgment system is, because I'm not assuming that any of you really are moral psychologists. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 4 challenges. I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of those 4 challenges, and then I'm going to present 2 strategies very briefly if I have time. I know we're starting to run up into some time issues that communicators might use to try and get around these challenges. And very quickly, the 4 are the abstractness and complexity of climate change, the blamelessness of unintentional action, motivated moral reasoning, and politicization and polarization on the issue of climate change. Okay, so the first one. The human moral judgment system is really strongly driven by our gut instincts, right? So we like to think that we are very good at reasoning through problems, that we can listen to, for example, the arguments that a moral philosopher might make, the points that I just raised about why climate change is an ethical issue, and that listening to those kind of reasons and reasoning through problems is what drives our moral judgments. But in fact, what research in the field of moral psychology, which has been around for a while but has had a renaissance in the last 10 to 15 years, suggests is that our moral judgments are really strongly influenced by our intuitions, by our gut feelings of right and wrong. Again, questions of right and wrong. That's really what I'm talking about when we talk about moral issues. The thing is that climate change, as some of you may know, is really not very good at generating a strong visceral gut reaction. Right? It's an abstract problem. It's distant both spatially and temporally. And it's also kind of incongruous, right? We know that some of the impacts involved, for example, are increased droughts in some places, but in other places it's increased rain and storm intensity, right? So for a bunch of reasons, climate change really just doesn't generate very strong visceral reactions, and as a result, doesn't, we think, generate very strong moral intuitions about what we should do about the issue, or that it's even a moral issue. So that's the first challenge. It's abstract and it's complex. Now the second is that the moral judgment system is not just very sensitive to intuition and to our gut reactions, but it's also very finely tuned to intentional moral transactions and transgressions. Right? So we're very quick to blame people, and it's very easy for us to see something as morally wrong when somebody intends to harm another person. Right? So we're very quick to blame intentional harm. But nobody wants climate change to happen, or if there is, they're really kind of weird, and there's not many of them. Right? Nobody really wants it to happen. It's really an unintended side effect of modern daily life, right? Of how all of us go about our daily lives, but nobody in this room and really nobody wants climate change to happen. And because it's an unintended side effect, it tends to generate weaker moral judgments, right? Because and there's some really interesting research that unintended negative consequences are blamed less severely than just as bad things that happen that are caused intentionally, right? But nobody wants climate change to happen. Now, at the same time, our beliefs about the causes of climate change also seem to affect our perceptions of moral obligation to do something about it. So in some research that I've been conducting, we've been interested in, one of the kind of basic questions that we ask people in public polling on climate change is, do you think that it's human-caused, or do you think that it's naturally occurring? And sometimes we say, or do you think it's both? Right? So given what we now know about how the moral judgment system operates, it's not too surprising that people who see climate change as naturally occurring are really not all that morally engaged with the issue, right? Because it's not something that humans have caused. And people tend to focus a lot on the causes as opposed to the outcomes, like the harms. But what I've found in some recent research that I think is really interesting is that there are differences that emerge in terms of perceptions of moral obligation to respond, even between anthropogenic and mixed group, right? The people who have these kind of mixed beliefs about the causes of climate change. It's both natural and human induced. And what's interesting is that the anthropogenic and mixed groups perceive the same level of harm, for example, towards future generations. They perceive the same level of efficacy, especially personal efficacy, right? They don't feel any different there. But the people in the anthropogenic group feel like they are more morally obligated to do something about climate change than people in the mixed group. And subsequently, their intention, they self-report higher intentions to actually do something that's pro-environmental and pro-climate. So there's something about our beliefs about the causation, and we know that in the US, it's actually a minority that believes that climate change is predominantly anthropogenic. It's something like 30% of Americans believe that it's an anthropogenic issue. And the rest are either mixed, naturally occurring, or just don't think that it's happening at all. Okay, so that's the second reason. Climate change, nobody wants climate change to happen. Now, a third challenge, and this is kind of a much broader one, is that the human moral judgment system is often very motivated. Right? We like to think of ourselves as generally decent and good people, and again, there's very few of us who don't like to think of ourselves that way. And we actually have a lot of tricks that we use to maintain that sort of self-image of ourselves as good people. Now, although climate change, as I just said, is not intentionally caused by anybody, as I'm sure all of you know, especially in the developed world and in particular in the US, we are often exposed to messages that blame us for having caused this problem. And this came up a little bit in some of our previous talks already. Right? So people are often made to try and feel guilty about climate change. In fact, that's often an explicit goal of some messaging campaigns on climate change, is that they want us to feel guilty about the issue. The thing is that we have a lot of strategies to try to avoid feeling guilty, including we blame other people for their inaction, we focus on how expensive it would be to respond, and we also actually maybe to some extent even revise our beliefs about the causes of climate change. Right? One way that we can reduce feeling guilty about it and feeling like we're to blame is to say, oh, climate change is not anthropogenic. It's actually mixed in causation, or it's naturally occurring. Right? So we have all these strategies, and we're very good at using these. And again, it's not a conscious process. This is generally an unconscious process. Now, in a related vein, there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding climate change. And nobody disagrees that there's uncertainty, right? There's uncertainty, especially in terms of what the consequences are going to be, who's going to be affected, and when. But the thing is that, again, because of the way that our, especially our moral judgment system operates, we can take that uncertainty and take the implications of it in the ways that kind of fit with what we want to already believe. And in the case of climate change, the uncertainty that surrounds the issue, particularly with respect to consequences, lets us interpret the possible outcomes in the most optimistic way possible. Right? It lets us think that the kind of most optimistic projections of the IPCC or whoever else is giving us information is more likely than is actually objectively the case. Right? So we're able to kind of avoid some of these negative thoughts. Again, moving us away from identifying climate change as this moral imperative. And then the fourth challenge that I want to talk about today is that the way that we talk about climate change, we do often talk about it as a moral issue. In fact, and this is quite related often to trying to frame it as an issue having, involving guilt and making us feel guilty. But when we talk about it as a moral issue, we often talk about it in terms of harm and fairness, right? Harm to future generations, harm to other species, and fairness in terms of the inequalities involved in who's causing the problem and who's going to bear those burdens. Now the thing is that research by John Haidt and some of his colleagues and others in the field of moral psychology over the past 10 years finds that harm and fairness considerations work really well for ideological liberals in the US. That for liberals, considerations of harm and fairness kind of really are the moral universe. Right? Those are the values that really generate strong moral intuitions about right and wrong. But for conservatives, while they care about harm and fairness, they have other values that are also elevated to the level of moral relevance. Things like loyalty to one's in-group, respect for authority, and especially the purity and sanctity beliefs, and the purity, especially of the human body. Those are not values that liberals just don't care about, but they are values that liberals don't consider as being morally relevant. Right? So there is this interesting research showing this divergence between conservatives and liberals within the US in terms of the values that underlie our beliefs about questions of right and wrong. And so when we talk about climate change predominantly as an issue of harm and fairness, we do a great job engaging liberals, but we really leave the conservatives unengaged. Now, the second piece of this is that once groups polarize, it's really difficult to bring them back to the middle. One reason is because we have these not just motivated moral reasoning, but a component of that is motivated information processing and seeking. Right? We go out and find information that already conforms to the beliefs that we already hold, and we kind of denigrate or ignore information that goes against the beliefs that we already hold. And the second piece of this is that we derive a lot of self-esteem from the groups that we belong to. Right? We get a lot out of our personal identities and our group identities. And so towing the party line is not just a thing that we just do, but we actually, it makes us feel better to toe that party line. So this is the fourth challenge that I think climate change poses to the moral judgment system. Okay, so what are the implications of this? Well, a lack of moral intuitions about climate change, I think, has a really serious potential to inhibit our desire and our willingness to really engage with the issue and to respond in a meaningful way. And again, in some of my own research, I found that individuals who feel less morally obligated to respond to the issue, maybe not too surprisingly, also report weaker intentions to perform pro-environmental and pro-climate type behaviors. On the other hand, when people do think about the kind of moral concerns and the moral relevance of climate change, for example, when people do think about the impacts on future generations, they tend to support, they tend to show higher support and stronger support for mitigation policies. And that's some work that Rachel Schwam and her colleagues have conducted. So the question for me is, how do we engage people at a moral level? And this is not to downplay any of the other stuff that we've heard today and the importance of getting people behaving in the way that we think that they should and then going from there. But this is another, I think this is another route to engage people. And I think it's a really powerful one. So just in the last few minutes, and I know I'm going quickly, but I want to get us through so we have time for questions and for Brittany. I'm just going to talk very briefly about two strategies that I think communicators might want to consider if the goal is to engage people at this moral level. That does not have to be your goal as a communicator, but if it is, I think there's some strategies that we can use. And they are to engage the moral values that people have, and this kind of subtle argument about burdens over benefits and carrots over sticks, and I'll explain what that means. Okay, so use the moral values that you've got. This ties directly into that last point that I just was talking about, the challenges. So consider this, this argument, and this is something that I pulled together, but you can see that it comes from the sorts of things that are out there in the mass media. So climate change already kills 300,000 people annually, and things are only going to get worse. People will lose their homes, species will go extinct. Do your part to stop the pain. But this is very clearly a harm-framed message, right? This is about harm to future generations, to other species. And contrast that with the following. We're messing with the way things used to be, the way they should be. Everyone has a responsibility to protect the sanctity of the earth we were given. And this is very much a purity-framed message. Now, some research by Matt Feinberg and Rob Willer up at UC Berkeley, Berkeley's above us, yes, up at UC Berkeley. What they've done is not these particular two messages, but what they've done is they've shown messages about environmental degradation to groups of conservatives and liberals. And one message is harm-framed and the other is purity-framed. And what they found is that the harm-framed message, which is more akin to the one on the left, works great for liberals. Liberals identify environmental degradation as a moral issue. They're concerned about it. They want to do something about it. But the harm-framed message doesn't really get conservatives going. But when they show conservatives the purity the message about environmental degradation, all of a sudden they recognize the issue as a moral one. And subsequently, they're more concerned about it and they're more engaged behaviorally. And importantly, and this is really critical, when they frame environmental degradation as a purity issue, they don't lose the liberals. Okay, liberals are just as engaged with the purity message. Because there is some data out there that suggests that messages that work for one group actually depress the other group, and you can actually make liberals, for example, less concerned about climate change by framing the solution to climate change as nuclear power. Right? So that's not really what we're shooting for here. Okay, so that's one strategy. So use the moral values that people have. Don't try to change people's moral values, but really speak to the values that people already hold and that motivate moral action. Now the second strategy is a little bit subtler, but I think it's kind of interesting, and there's some research still to be done on this topic. So there are at least two dimensions that we can think about when we're talking about, for example, the impacts that climate change is going to have on future generations. One is whether we're talking about it in a positive way or a negative frame, and that's what we're kind of used to, whether we're talking about climate change is going to cause XYZ problem or mitigating climate change is going to solve XYZ current problem, or it's going to do good things for people. So that's kind of a positive versus negative frame. But there's another alternative, there's another kind of 2x2 here, and that's the distinction between burdens and benefits that Kim Wei-Benzoni and her colleagues at the Fuqua School at Duke have talked about. And it's easiest with an example. So here's a negative frame to start. Climate-related natural disasters are expected to. And the burden might be to diminish food and clean water supplies. Right? So food and clean water supplies are good things. We like to give those to people, and we don't want to get rid of those things. So here we're talking about a negatively framed, if climate change happens, these good things that we like are going to go away. Now that's in contrast with climate change is going to lead to greater spread of infectious diseases such as malaria and dengue fever. So diseases are a bad thing. They're a burden. And here what we're talking about in a negative frame is that climate change, if we don't do anything about it, is going to increase this burden on the future. Now the work that Kim and her colleagues have done suggests that when we frame climate change in terms of burdens rather than benefits, people recognize it as a moral issue more readily, and they feel more concerned, and they want to do more to help the future. And so it's distinct. So this burdens versus benefits sounds a lot like positive versus negative, but it's not. It's really the valence of the actual thing that we're talking about is going to change as a result. Now, here's the other half of this 2x2. Now, rather than saying what climate change is going to do, now we're going to talk about mitigating climate change is going to lead to maintaining and improving food and clean water supplies versus mitigating climate change is going to prevent the greater spread of burdens and of these burdens, right, of diseases. Okay, so this is subtle, but I think hopefully I've made it clear enough that this is a 2x2, right? Burdens versus benefits and positive versus negative frames. Now, as far as I know, there's no research that's been done on the full 2x2, and the research that I have on it, I don't have any data yet to present to you today. But the suggestion that we have is, one, that burdens are generally recognized as more morally relevant than benefits. Right? They kind of carry more moral weight. And we can kind of think about why that might be the case, right? Giving somebody something good doesn't necessarily seem as much of an obligation as making sure that you don't do something bad to somebody, right? That's kind of the do no harm mentality. Right? So that's why burdens are a bigger kind of pull morally. And then there's also research suggesting that positive frames generally are more attractive to people and don't make us turn off the same way that a negative frame does, right? Because a positive frame, when we talk about what mitigating climate change is going to do, generates hope rather than guilt and sadness. So the suggestion from a theoretical perspective is that concentrating on burdens framed in a positive way may get people more morally engaged with the issue. Okay, but this is research that has to be done, and I think it's a small piece, but again, it's a potentially important piece for communicators in this issue. So just to finish up, I think to the extent that climate change remains a technical and political and scientific and economic issue it's going to be really hard to get people engaged with the issue. Those are fine frames to think about it in, and it's fine to talk about climate change that way. But moral issues are really important issues to people. And so to the extent that we can find ways to increase recognition of climate change as a moral issue, I think we really have the potential to get people really engaged in this issue. And the final thing I'll say is that it's not easy to talk about climate change with people, as I'm sure many of you know, and it's not easy to talk about morality with people. Like, people get really sensitive when they feel like you're using moralizing language. So communicators have to be really careful if they're going to go into this kind of combination of climate change and morality. But I think the kinds of strategies that I've laid out here, and that I think maybe we'll hear about a little bit more, and some others that I didn't have time to talk about today, but that are in the paper, have the potential to lead us in that direction in a positive way. Thank you.